Good morning, everyone. We'll leap into the third day's first session. We're due to finish at 10:30, so we thought we'd start now and let others join the fun before 10:30. My name's David Howard. I'm here with Sharae, Deckard and Dylan Kerrigan. The idea this morning was to have an interactive session. We sent round 2 articles, and I'll tell you a little bit about those later, but they're on the overhead projector. And I think in some ways this session is quite pertinent in that we're looking at ideas of myth and resilience. And lots of the discussion over the last day or 2 days has been the interrelation between transdisciplinary academic research, but also the role of myth or discourse. And I think we're very lucky in Lucy's brilliant planning to overlap this networking conference with 2 days of a multilateral crime summit in Kingston. So not only a lot of policy and practitioners doing stuff downtown, also there's a lot of reflection on crime in the media. And the debate yesterday in the front page of the Gleaner was, it creates quite a storm, a media storm, probably a popular storm as well, in that the media says, okay, Jamaica, we need more informants. And for I guess those working in this field, the notion of informant has many different sort of perspectives. There's a notion that really to fight this current, another wave of crime, or violent crime within Jamaica, it was up to the people of Jamaica to inform on those engaged in crime. So I think that again reflects on some of the papers where we looked at the role of newspapers, media output, and in many ways fictional accounts to create stories, narratives about real and fictive protagonists and groups. So this next sort of, I guess, 50 minutes, we'll look at the link between crime, ideas of myth-making, and link that within ideas of resilience. And resilience, as you might know, is a term that has evolved really since the 70s, primarily from an ecological background, and has moved more into the social discursive field of resilience. But essentially, by and large, resilience is sort of seen as something that's good. It's sort of, yeah, if you're resilient, generally it's a good characteristics to have. But resilient communities tend to be strong communities. But I think what we'll be doing, hopefully, in this discussion is questioning ideas of resilience. I mean, is it good to be future-proofed? Why would you be resilient to a system that's actually sort of screwing you over effectively? You know, why would you maintain a certain position within a system? So to help facilitate my fading memory, we're hoping to record the discussion for two reasons. Firstly, hopefully we'll put the discussion online as part of the network's outreach dissemination. And the other aspect would be to use the transcript to maybe write up this discussion as a sort of co-authored network production to it. Okay, well, thanks very much. We'll record the session, and the transcripts, the oral transcript, I think, will be available to all and also put on the web. So the 2 articles we sort of sent around, and we're really, you know, in the perfect world, everyone's read them, and we're all sort of leaping and sort of talking about various points of Adger's and Hoare's 2 articles. But realistically, we've read them, and we've sort of pitched up the ideas that we think they might contribute in a positive or negative way to understandings of crime and policing that we're covering over this network. If that's okay. So I'll just start. We'll just have about 5 or 7 minutes each. And then Sharae would speak on her perceptions of the articles, and then Dylan, and then really it'd be open floor to discuss how some of the ideas interrelate with our practical-based activities, our research, or whether they're totally irrelevant. So, we'll start with Stuart Hall, as many great studies of the Caribbean, or many good discussions of the Caribbean have done. Stuart Hall gave an essay entitled Myths of Caribbean Identity, and he wrote, histories come and go, peoples come and go, situations change, but somewhere down there is throbbing the culture to which we all belong. It provides a kind of ground for identities, something stabilised, around which we can organise our identities and our sense of belonging. And I read that many years ago and reread it recently, and that really speaks in many ways to what we hopefully are discussing today, the ideas of myths, myth-making, community belonging, stability, and then we're going to add our insights upon aspects of contemporary crime. So, in terms of myth, these are part of what Kai Hoare's article talks about, and my reflections on the ideas of myth. Kai Hoare talks about myths as essentially a means of normalising the world around us by making extraordinary ordinary and the ordinary extraordinary. And her article, and I think arguably many ways of myth production focus on local cultural myths. And particularly from our discussions the last couple of days, we really have been talking about myths generated by individuals, but also around so-called garrison communities, or specific parts of the Jamaican landscape, but also the Caribbean urban social landscapes. And the importance of myth-making in many cases is locality and place, as well as the individual. And there's an argument that locality not only mediates, moderates our interactions with the urban fabric around us individuals, but also mediates our interactions. And Hawes writing up in her articles, looking at youth groups within inner city in the UK, and she argues actually the myth-making within the communities is a formative part of how young people operate and operationalise themselves within their day-to-day lives. And I think what Hawes' article and her ongoing work looks at is quite key in terms of showing myths are explicit or implicit invitations to shape the actions of individuals. So she's really focusing around myth, around the individual and the locality or place. And as we'll see, ideas of resilience don't tend to focus on the individual. You don't sort of future-proof individuals. You don't really talk, by and large, particularly in the background I'm from geography and development work, you don't talk more about resilient communities or resilient systems or frameworks. So Kai Hoare talks about the notion of myth course, and she's obviously having interplay there between the ideas of how myths shape our interactions and activities, but also with the ideas of discourse analysis. And she defines myths further as connective structures allowing individuals to make links between the external world around us, our external lived worlds, social mediatic representations, which is very much what we discussed over yesterday and really over the whole network in terms of looking at representations of crime and policing and our own internal felt narratives. And she argues that the myth course is that sort of engagement with internal external worlds that then reflect upon the ways we act or react against those narratives. And she works with the work of Lossev, who talks about mythic feedback loops. And we won't go into my very poor philosophical skills, but Lossev argues that myths have a very particular process within the individual psychologies and psyches. The fact they provide a sense of ontological security. Myths tend to sort of secure ideas in our lives that we're not really sure of. You know, there's something there, we don't know how it works, but let's create a myth. It might be a thunderous god from a Norwegian fjord is setting up life in a certain way, or it might be other deities or spirits, but certain myths that then make sense of the world around us. So if we look at Kai's work, what I've tried to summarise, she argues, and generally, myths, you can argue, are consumed, produced, they're promoted and they're manipulated. And maybe what we've been focusing on, particularly yesterday, was to some extent the production, but particularly the promotion, manipulation of myths. Okay? And myth, of course, she argues, is that process whereby these narratives become normalised, dramatised, or fantasised about. And there's those mythic feedback loop, an easily understandable, digestible format. And I think some of the themes we've been talking about, particularly yesterday, about the representations, the oral, visual, and oral understandings of myth, particularly around ideas of dons or leadership. We've looked at ideas of loyalty, honour, respect, but also that double-edged sword of fear, omnipotence, and fate. So, when we bring the idea of myth or myth course towards resilience, I think there are some key connecting points, but also some key dislocating aspects. Oh gosh, how did that happen? Just not that time. Howard moves projector after knocking it. Okay. First of all, we can argue, is resilience relevant for describing communities? And there's been a wide range of critiques saying, well, no, it's not. And I think one of the most popular and persuasive counter-arguments against the idea of resilience as always good, something to strive for, was after New Orleans after the flooding and events in New Orleans, where a series of posters went up saying, look, I'm not resilient. I don't want to be resilient. Stop trying to make me resilient. Because resilience got us into the mess in the first place. We were trying to live within an urban system that was dysfunctional. So don't try and produce policies of resilience. I think Sharae's going to talk a wee bit more about this, but the idea of social resilience is the ability of groups or communities to cope with external threats, sudden changes, or they might be slow, gradual, transformative change. And I think in the case of some of my research has been looking at post-2010 in Kingston, and I think what is very interesting about the incursion in Kingston, Jamaica, and sorry for those of you who aren't focusing on Jamaica, is the incursion in some ways could be seen as a sudden dramatic shock to the system being, you could say, the formal form of governance, but the system obviously is the way that the informal governance of gang networks. Coke's system was particularly very effective. But you had that sudden dramatic shock of the incursion, but you could argue that the greatest shock was a sudden removal of that informal form of governance and that gradual change to residents in downtown in areas where the disciplined gang, the Stinger group or various gangs really provided day-to-day living governance or livable governance. So social resilience is really focused on the idea at the community level. So there's an initial idea, well, can myth that's generated and relates to the individual really be connected with ideas of resilience, which tends to operate at the community level and arguably operates in the form of social capital. Social resilience arguably can be seen as a form of social capital. It also encompasses ideas of vulnerability, which again have sort of been a backdrop to our discussions. And I think I was at a conference here a few years ago on a similar theme. It was actually looking at resilience, but vulnerability was, every other paragraph or page or discussion mentioned vulnerability. And it's interesting, I don't think we've mentioned vulnerability in our discussions, but clearly it's the backdrop of many of our concerns. And you could argue that myth, actually, however, is compatible with ideas of resilience thinking, because myth arguably operates against change. Most myths are reproducing the status quo in some ways. Myths don't generally change society. That's a very grand statement that I'm very willing to be knocked down as we discuss matters. But the idea of resilience thinking is a certain criticality, the notion of change. At a certain point, a system is disconfigured, then reforms itself at a slightly different level. Okay? So you could argue that myth really operates against that notion of critical change, of rapid transformation. Right, final comments, and then Sharae is up next. I think what I found interesting is that both myth and resilience really focus around ideas of stasis and stability. And is that really desirable? As I mentioned before, do we want to go back to the level we were beforehand after a sudden or gradual shock? I think, again, I think Sharae is going to talk to this more, but I think just in part of our transdisciplinary journey, no, I hate that word, our transdisciplinary initiative, the article by Deckard does link social and ecological resilience, and I think we often don't think about that. But all good geographers will leap into a foray and say, well, actually, no, we need to think about the ecological, physical, biophysical environment. And I think that's very clear when considering, again, looking at Kingston, the impact of a lowering aquifer, the issues of collective consumption of water, the very act of getting water from the standpipe when there isn't any water there, the flash floods in Jamaica in March, April, arguably a result of heavy rains, but also arguably a result of garbage filling up the gutters and drains. And hurricanes, clearly they have a big impact in very specific time periods across the Caribbean. I think resilience, social resilience particularly operates not only at the community level but at institutional level. And by institutional level we can refer to that really as, yes, forms of informal or formal governance, but also socialised modes of behaviour, an institutional way of operating within a workshop and how we operate in a workspace. It's a socialised form of behaviour that could be perceived or defined as an institution. I think myths in many ways embed a form of social resistance, particularly myths around the anti-hero, anti-heroine. There's a notion of social resistance there which clearly speaks to ideas of resilience thinking. Can we see myth as a form of social capital? Social resilience is definitively defined and used in policymakers as a form of positive social capital. And finally, really, I'm quite interested in the ideas of obduracy. So those of you who are excited about urban infrastructure will have read Hummels, who talks about cities. One of the sort of the positive and negative points of cities is their physical and material infrastructure. I mean, roads tend to last for centuries. If we look at London, the road network was laid down in pre-Roman times. And there's that level of obduracy, of consistency, that actually can be a form of infrastructural resilience and strength, but also can be a sign of weakness, because you have a lock-in effect. You have a material lock-in to old railway lines, etc. And I think you can very easily transfer the idea of obduracy to social infrastructure. And if we define that social infrastructure as forms of myths, which then start shaping individuals' daily lives, again, we can look at the positive or negative aspects of obduracy. So I think in sum, I'm quite interested, and hopefully our discussion will look at that interlink between crime and resilience and say, well, actually, are our understanding or are the perceptions or the actions to combat crime supported by ideas of myth? And I think these questions were hovering around all our discussions yesterday. What is the role of this interpretation of this novel? How does this art change, transform people's engagement with the world around them? And I'm moving rapidly on to Sharae, so over to you.
Okay, so if yesterday I had my Marlon James hat on, today I'm speaking more from the perspective of my research that's been involved in thinking about the intersections between social and environmental crisis, particularly through viewpoints drawn from post-colonial environmental criticism and disaster studies, which would emphasize that natural disasters or environmental crises are always social disasters, whether it's Katrina or whether it's a hurricane or whether it's flooding. It is experienced as a disaster because of the conditions in which people exist when that event occurs. So I want to use my response to reflect briefly on the relationship between what we might think of as green crime and the environment, using Adger's argument that social and ecological resilience are fundamentally interdependent as a jumping off point. Resilience discourses founded in socio-ecological perspectives of systems have importantly contributed to the intellectual understanding of the ways in which the social and ecological are interdependent, understanding urban environments, for example, as bundles of ecological, biophysical, and social processes in which humans, animals, plants, and their interactions with a constructed environment are intertwined in a single ecology. However, many political ecologists and geographers have critiqued resilience thinking because the concept of resilience has difficulty foregrounding relations of power and can be mobilized in such a way that it obscures the active degree of violence and exploitation of people and their ecologies and portrays them as passively enduring or experiencing stressors or threats from outside, as opposed to outright onslaughts on their livelihoods, as in the case of land clearances and accumulation via dispossession sponsored by both states and transnational corporations. There's also the problem of attributing vulnerability or victimhood as an affective or ontological state to people when you want to be able to talk about their precarity of their experience, but you also need to be able to reclaim their possibilities for agency and resistance. So there are problems in employing those terms. Resilience discourse can imply a degree of passive survival, that is, the ability of populations to survive whatever new form of exploitation, extractivism, environmental degradation, or environmental disasters is perpetrated on them, rather than the need for the active agency of both individuals and communities in resisting such depredations. And I'm thinking here of the kind of useful concept, though it can also be criticized in terms of its conception of class, but the concept that the environmental historians and sociologists Joanne Martinez-Allier and Ramachandra Guha have described as the environmentalism of the poor, or the resource insurgencies, which are not usually rooted in priorities of conservation, but rather in fighting for the very environmental conditions and resources which enable the survival of communities. And the need for an active holding to accountability of the particular powers which perpetrate forms of ecological imperialism and exploitation. I'm also interested perhaps in this concept of myth and thinking about, does it really encourage stasis? If you think about the environmentalist movements that we see in contexts of resource insurgency, in which alternative cosmologies of nature, alternative conceptions of people's relation to the environment are often specifically mobilized. So if you think about, say, the water wars in Bolivia and the endless signs that say, gold is not life, water is life. You can live without gold, you cannot live without water. These are kind of actively asserting a particular conception of water as life, which is often drawing on indigenous ideas of the environment, or if you might think of the Mayan cosmologies, which are implicated in much of the Zapatista activism against big water projects, against mining. In these cases, it's not necessarily myth as an alternative belief system, is often integral to the assertion of communities' rights and capacity to organize. The urban ecologist Henrik Ernsten has argued that resilience thinking has been co-opted from its origins in the philosophy of ecologists, where it had a very strong ethical valence and an important one, to become a research policy framework deployed by a growing network of experts, consultants, think tanks, technocrats, and institutions to repair, quote, the marketization of the privatization of ecological relations, particularly in urban environments. As such, the framework is in danger, he says, of asking for resilience while keeping the relations of power intact. So again, those signs after Katrina, I don't want to be resilient. I want to change the very structures of the city which have rendered me exposed to the violence of the hurricane. As such, and as Alf Hornberg has sardonically remarked in a different context, we needed a revolution, instead we got resilience. The language of risk and hazard, which is employed by Ager, can also be problematic in that debt, speculation, risk, hazard, and fear are structurally inherent to the futures produced by the neoliberal regime of finance capitalism. Risk discourses are often informed by or co-opted and appropriated by insurance industries and financial institutions that naturalize the idea of certain populations and environments as being exposed to calculable levels of risk and hazard, and which can be deployed by states and military institutions invested in the securitization and discipline of so-called risky populations. Thus, I would like to briefly suggest that a discussion of the interdependence between crime and environmental conditions needs to foreground hierarchical relations of power, and that it can do so by drawing on cross-disciplinary insights from post-colonial environmental critics, disaster studies, green criminology, and political ecology. Green criminology focuses on forms of environmental crime, which Rees Walters observes are often constituted in invisible violence. These often entail not physical or spectacular violence committed by individuals, such as shootings with guns, but rather forms of structural and systemic violence, which Zizek has argued is the often catastrophic consequence of the smooth functioning of our economic and political systems. Rob Nixon, the post-colonial critic, has referred to these as slow violence, the processes of toxification, radiation, pollution, or disruption of access to water and soil and food that often are invisible or difficult to perceive, and that have a long temporality of accumulating damage over time as biomagnification, as cellular mutation, as deprivation. These forms of violence can include industrial disasters, leaks and spills, whether the BP Gulf oil spill or the poisoning of the Niger Delta by Dutch Shell or the Bhopal industrial disaster in India, or they can include forms of extractivism like bauxite mining in Jamaica that poisons watersheds and strips environments of their capacity to produce food. The temporalities of these forms of violence are often incremental and cumulative, perpetrated at macro or international scales by corporations, industries, states, and supranational institutions. Robert Harding has argued that the greatest problem facing criminology is that of anthropogenic global climate change, asking, quote, what can criminology and criminologists do to decrease the chances of the extinction of humanity and the destruction of the planet? From his perspective, we could see things like nuclear technologies, genetic engineering, corporate bioprospecting and biopiracy, environmental despoilation, land and water enclosures, carbon combustion and mineral extractivism as forms of environmental crimes which collectively affect communities and their ecosystems, impacting most severely the inhabitants of post-colonial environments who are already wrestling with the legacies of centuries of green imperialism and environmental engineering under colonialism, as in the case of the Caribbean, where sugar plantations and other forms of resource monoculture have radically altered environments and rendered populations vulnerable to both economic boom-bust cycles and price volatility, but also to environmental degradation as a result of desertification and deforestation. In the neoliberal era, these same societies now confront compounded catastrophes and newly intensified forms of environmental violence as climate volatility, increased severity of meteorological events such as hurricanes, rising sea levels, increased incident of drought and hydrological crisis, coral bleaching, mangrove and dune deforestation, and eutrophication and acidification of marine and freshwater ecosystems all undermine the conditions for life, increasing the vulnerability of rural, coastal, and urban populations. Indeed, Efeli Pita, the ambassador of Tuvalu to the United Nations, recently argued that island nations, not just in the Pacific but in the Caribbean, confront what he calls a global warming war, which is more important than the war on drugs, in which their conflict is not with, quote, guns and missiles, but with weapons from everyday lives, chimney stacks, and exhaust pipes. He placed emphasis not on individual domestic carbon consumption, but rather on the greatest polluters, industrial corporations, particularly those companies such as oil companies invested in the extraction of fossil fuels, which could be considered the most culpable for perpetrating what he called the crime of global warming. Likewise, global monetary policies such as economic structural adjustment and austerity and forms of environmental racism and sexism that create unequal access to resource catchments, discriminating against minorities and indigenous populations can equally be understood as forms of environment making that are implicated in undermining the basis of livelihoods and pushing communities into informal economies of criminal or black market activity in order to survive. Forms of slow violence increase both internal and external migration of what Ramachandra Guha has called eco-refugees. This, of course, is visible in strong trends towards deruralization and an increase of urbanization, which places greater pressures on the infrastructures of urban environments, which are often underfunded or unevenly developed due to the imposition of structural adjustment policies which insisted on asset stripping, defunding, and deregulation of state services, such as water provision, municipal sanitation, and a regulation of air and water pollution. So again, your reading of the floods here is very appropriate. However, environmental violence also exacerbates the vulnerability, and I just used that word there, of those who cannot move due to poverty, to political conflict, or to the enforcement of national and regional border policies. Rob Nixon calls these the displaced without moving, who inhabit toxic, depleted, or actively disabling environments which have been deprived of the very qualities which made them inhabitable, trapped with insufficient access to clean air, to water, to waste disposal, or to land, and with radically decreased food security. In all these incidences, the question of what constitutes crime or resilience must be assessed to take the specific power relations and hierarchies structuring people's places in environments and their access to basic resources and environmental rights, both to understand why certain forms of illegal and criminalized activity, such as the thing that we've been talking about a lot, the production that is the growth, but also the trafficking and trading of drug commodities, might be compensating for degraded environmental conditions, including basic water and food insecurity and structural unemployment, but also to reevaluate the notion of what constitutes criminal activity at different scales, to think about the crimes perpetrated not only at the individual level, but at national and international scales of green crime and corporate violence. All right, thank you.
you very much. And over to you, Dylan.
Yeah, well, that was fantastic. Mine's not on that level, but we will talk about a few things. I really concentrated on the first article by Kate Hall, which spoke to me in lots of ways, because I'm doing a research project in East Port of Spain that's quite similar to the project she lays out, except we don't use video, we use spoken word poetry. So we set up sessions over 15 weeks with 16 to 20-year-old youngsters who go to Serval, and Serval is a particular school at the bottom rung where kids who fall through the cracks kind of get scooped up, and they learn certain skills like trades skills and that sort of stuff. It's less academic, and a lot of these students live in areas of high community violence and have difficult economic and social situations. And in some ways what we wanted to do is we wanted to find out how they experience these communities, what they have to say about what they think the problems are, why they think their lives have been sort of scarred in certain ways, but they don't often have the necessarily all the ideas in some ways, and they do what you suggest. In some ways they create their own narratives. I wouldn't necessarily call them myths. They create their own narratives, and what we do is we kind of throw in some experts every now and again, like experts on gender-based violence or weaponization or a variety of different things. And then we go back to the spoken word poems, and we try to work with them to do these poems to sort of get their ideas out. And it functions on a number of levels. One, I think it empowers them rather than makes them resilient, because they then want to share these ideas with other people, and they start talking about youth leadership and youth movements, which we found very impressive. And of course not all the kids go through the program in successful ways. Some drop by the wayside and never return, and we wonder sometimes to do follows up with them. So that happens on lots of levels in terms of working through some of their own ideas. But it also works as a very interesting data collection vehicle, because you build up a very nice repertoire and relationship and rapport with the young people. For instance, I have WhatsApp groups with them. We talk quite a lot. I've taken them to UE. I've taken them to the UN. I've taken them to forestry sites to learn about stuff. And it sort of expands their minds. So what was quite interesting about the article is it's talking about similar ways of trying to get the experience of young people also in an urban area. But I felt, in a more critical way, the article was pivoting on this idea of resilience, and we didn't really find resilience was useful in our Caribbean fieldwork context. What we felt was more useful was trying to work towards empowerment, right? So there was three things I wanted to talk about that I noted really from the reading. And the first is, what is myth? The second thing is about funders and funding. And the third is the relevance of resilience, right? I felt like when the author here was speaking about myth, that they didn't really define it as I would understand it in an anthropological context, being, obviously that's my disciplinary background. And it actually made me feel that what the author was doing themselves was creating a bunch of myths within academia and about academic work. So I kind of threw it back on them. What did they really mean by myths? And sometimes it was just a community myth in this paper was simply an idea that local people held, whether they were true or not. And really the only first example that comes out is in the back end of the article, where they talk about the American urban crime tale. And then the author sort of flippantly says another myth was that the police were bribed and paid off. Well, in the Caribbean, that's exactly what happens. That's not a myth. So for me, in comparative terms, that was quite problematic. So for me, I wasn't utterly convinced that the myth source really works, because in some ways, and this is another thing I was thinking, that isn't resilience in some way an academic myth that sort of neoliberal funders sort of push us to discover and build within our own work. And in some ways, when we go after resilience, it justifies our work as moving or contributing to social change, when really I feel like it's reinforcing some of the oppressive structures that really exist there. So on that level, I felt the myth source or myth here problematic, but obviously I can't speak as an expert to her field site and what was happening in, I guess it was Manchester. I'm not sure if that's where it was, but Nottingham, right? And so that's why I kind of tried to put it into Caribbean context terms of my own field work. And I felt like turning around and telling the young people I work with that what you're telling me is a myth wasn't a successful strategy, right? Try to understand why they have these narratives, try to make them better understand those narratives, but in a dialogue, not me going to them, hey, this is a myth and you need to understanding it that way, or we're going to use it in that way. So what do they think about the stories when you give them more information and when they sort of like talk about it amongst themselves? And also, don't forget that because I'm an anthropologist, I do this because I want to collect data and see what they say, right? So that's why one of the reasons I felt that it was slightly different. The second thing that it made me think about was the question about funders and funding and the way they shape what we can do or cannot do and what we should be looking for or not looking for, right? And in many ways, I feel like funding, and so we got some money from the AHRC, $1 million TT dollars to do our work for 18 months, right? And in many ways, when you look back on what we did and the hoops you have to jump through in order to get the money, it's really, you have to promise sort of band-aid solutions. You can't promise structural change, right? But we all want kind of bigger changes, so you have to go after the band-aid solutions. And it reminded me of what I wrote in my own proposal, and so points A and C of my own proposal. So I'm actually falling into the same trap because we're doing some work, not just in Port of Spain, we're comparing it to Belize City as well, the urban area of Belize, right? Which has also had very great upturns in violence in the 1990s and 2000s. So point A of our research proposal to the ERSC was compare recent male trajectories of those who engage in violence against those who do not, understand male resilience to violence and where it emerges from and how. As such, we'll be mapping resistance to violent trajectories of young men. And then point C, identify community-level activities that lead to resilience against violence. Conversely, identify those that facilitate or sanction violence. Gender these approaches to consider male or female roles in the resilience of promotion of violence in communities. So in many ways, it made me feel that the whole kind of, well, I think I'll save the final bit because I want to link the three together. So I'm going to come back to the funding part and link it back to resilience and myth, okay? So resilience is, language and use of funding agencies, which kind of, in many ways, facilitates or I think improves your ability to get grant money, right? So again, I feel like my work when I got onto the ground really wasn't about resilience, but was about sort of empowerment and empowering young people to sort of work, not just to build themselves up, but to turn to other people that they care about within their community and build them up, right? So it's a natural circle that they do themselves. It's not like we're going to save the community, right? It's the individuals themselves in the community that help each other and they work together, right? The other thing about resilience I felt in this paper is it completely removed the context or backstory of what is really happening in urban fields. I've got no history about urban fields. I have no idea who the people are there or where it comes from or what the kind of social discourse or economic discourse was. And it reminded me of self-help books, right? You know those way that self-help books will talk about resilience? A defining feature of self-help texts is that they propose a careful and systematic self-examination of certain aspects of readers' conduct in everyday life. And that sounded like what she was doing with the myth, right? Other assumptions and claims I kind of noted include things like, the power of thinking positively about stuff, and negative emotions can be overcome, and success and happiness and empowerment have nothing to do with history or biography, right? They're all about how you feel, or all about being self-resilient, or having making better choices, and having self-made success and all this kind of stuff. And I feel that kind of narrative, and I think the author, I don't think obviously they did it, but it creates a sort of a thin self, disconnected from the, it's almost like those the spaghetti westerns where you're looking at the building but behind it there's nothing there, right? And that was the kind of impression that I was getting about these young people, right? And I didn't feel that was really a fair way for an ethnographer to play the game, right? I felt that they needed to give me some more of the realities of the everyday stresses and the anxieties and the precarization of the situation. So I thought that was quite difficult to deal with, and it reminded me a little bit of how Nicole Ashcroft speaks in The New Prophets of Capitalism about Oprah Winfrey, right? I was like, she says, by emphasizing individual strategies for success, Oprah and other prophets of the empowered self downplay the real structures of power and inequality in our society. They place the burden of success on the individual, in the process disguising societal shortcomings as personal failures and blinding us to the collective visions of change that challenge alienation and inequality. And I think it's really important, right? But collectivism is really where social change comes from, right? Yeah, it's great to have strong individuals and resilient individuals, but without sort of a collective movement, you can't really get political change, because politics is about people, right? So you need collectivism, unless you can get the elites to just do it for you, right? Which is really what happens. So towards the end of thinking about this, the three things sort of came together. The whole idea about resilience, the myth that academics themselves are involved in developing and producing, and this kind of self-help idea, which again kind of switched to what my colleague here was more talking about in terms of neoliberal narratives about what creates success. So what I was thinking was, if you return to ideas about funding agencies and the hoops they make you jump to, and sort of the neoliberal turn of audit cultures that many British universities have gone through, I felt that the article and the piece of research demonstrates how neoliberal ideologies, myths about the individual, and academic research come together to produce knowledge that gives the impression of we're trying to make a change, but that simply sort of moves the food around on the plate. It doesn't really make a substantial kind of contribution to changing the situation. So for me, it wasn't really about feedback loops and discourse, as the author suggests. For me, it's about economic, social, and cultural resources and the distribution of these resources. And in some ways, these kind of fancy arguments, that you lose sight of that, right? Because we're focused simply on making young people more resilient as a solution. But also, we know that's where the research monies come from. There's this sort of nexus that we're not really focused on the real mechanisms of the transformation and really the economic system. We actually kind of become part of the continuities with these vast and unsustainable inequalities, really. So that's my more sort of critical take. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Steve. There's 15 minutes now for a discussion. I think it's an interesting take, and I like this spaghetti western board. I don't know the author, but I probably, in her defence, she does say, I've published all the ethnography, and this is an article just to talk about the method of, she's video, and so yes. She did all her method for video. So this is not about the actual topic of the research itself, but she said by the process of videoing or getting the youth groups to video themselves, that encapsulated myths, but somehow the video itself brought the external and internal into a visual format. But I think definitely in terms of, you didn't have a sense of who these people were. But yeah, thank you. Who would like to leap into the? Yes, brilliant. And then at the back, yeah. Well, can you say our names actually, just for when it's. So I put in the centre.
I have two things to say. Maybe I'll start with one. We'll see how long it takes me. The other thing. I wanted to. I didn't read the papers because I wasn't part of the network communication that preceded this conference. But one of the things that I just want to kind of drop into this discussion is the way in which resilience is playing out within national security discourses. It's a concept that is being promoted in national security agendas of the US, Israel, and places that produce global national security agendas. And it's produced as a counterpoint to the discourse of trauma. And it's produced as a counterpoint to the infliction of trauma. And we have to think, very, very carefully about the way in which we might want to use concepts like trauma and resilience in the way that they are used by national security apparatuses. There's a lot of examples for the way that inflicting trauma on populations has become part of, managing them, taking them shock and awe, if we're thinking about things of that sort. And the other side of it, and it's really kind of a classical biopolitical equation, which is maintaining the wellness and well-being of the other part of the population. So what does it mean that one part of the population is constantly traumatized with a form of governance, and the other one is the well-being and resilience of the other part of the population is sustained and maintained. And of course, the way in which a lot of theorists connect these developments into contemporary trends in capitalism, right? High-risk, volatile capitalism that is no longer grounded in the idea of constant growth, but is actually grounded in the idea of crisis. That profits are created through crisis and not created through constant, stable, systematic growth. I think there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle to put together. I think that might help our discussion if we're thinking about crimes. And then maybe a minor point is that in terms of myth. The question of myth, which I think, myth and can be true at the same time. It seems to me, like something can be, because if a myth is more something that helps people organize their everyday experiences, helps all of us interpreting our lived experience, then it's not a question so much if it's true or false, right? It's a question of more, for me, in the context like the Caribbean or other contexts, where the Israeli-Palestinian context, right? What do you do when the national myth is so grounded in a real history of trauma? It's not a made-up history of trauma, right? Holocaust happened, slavery happened, but these things also, they operate both as grounding national myth, and that have critical, right, potential as well as hegemonic ideological potential at the same time. So I think, these are my 2 points.
I think that's the important part. The myths can be positive and negative. I was just thinking of Icelandic sagas. The Icelandic myths are the grounding tenets of first democracy in many ways. So I think that's interesting. Thank you. At the back, we have.
Well, that was University of the West Indies, Central Western. I found the presentations to be particularly interesting, so thanks to Sharae and David. Although I came in a bit late, so I only got part of David's presentation, but indeed, I think that they were very interesting. So that's a comment. The question aspect looks at the myths surrounding female involvement in crime, and I didn't really get much on that, because indeed, the literature seems to be showing, especially for the Caribbean, that one of our myths is that females aren't involved in crime, deviance, delinquency, and also gangs. And if we fail to address that myth, then indirectly we will be failing in terms of strengthening the resilience of the females. Because what will happen is that the problem will continue to grow. We will not see it as a problem indeed until it gets to a stage probably where it gets out of hand, and then we'll try to address it. So I don't know if anyone could talk me through any, whether you came across that in your research or whether it was addressed, will be addressed, etc.
Well, I don't know if I can answer your question, but I do know one thing that happened within the experience, the research that I was talking about, is that we worked with 10 men and 10 women, and being a man, I found it very difficult to really get into the narratives of the young women that I was working with, right? That just simply because some of the things they wanted to talk about were quite intimate and quite difficult to talk about. So on one level, I felt that one of the problems with me and myths that might be circulating around young women was that I didn't have access to it, right? I didn't have access to those conversations. I needed to recruit a young female psychologist who I worked with to do that. So there was a natural sort of, blockage within my own research kind of capabilities to actually even get into that conversation about the myths. So rather I get it through the men talking about the women, right? Or young men talking about women, which is often full of its own myths, right? So in a way, it's almost, for me personally, I felt it was a bit like, being caught between lots of mirrors. You weren't really sure what's really true and what's not true, right? I know it doesn't really answer your question, but just from a sort of actual methodological problem, one of the things we went into the community and I'm going to collect all this information, and obviously when we got there it wasn't actually possible to do in terms of female narratives. It was much easier to do with the young men. So yeah, that's sort of tangential to what you were asking.
I'd say open it to everyone, because I suppose that's not some question and answers. Chip in everyone as well, please do. Sorry, Sarah,
I was going to say, that has been a bit of a theme, I think, on the first day, that people were kind of talking about the ways, and I was having a conversation with Melissa this morning about how women, like how she doesn't like to use the term vulnerability, because when she's thinking, sorry, I'm paraphrasing you, so tell me if I'm being terribly, doesn't like to use the term vulnerable very much because the Guyanese women that she knows or have been at the forefront of often of organized resistance, of organization against forms of violence and crime, but also that individually they're incredibly strong, they're active, they're agent, and that the kind of vulnerable word or the resilient word doesn't quite describe the fact that they are in this position of having, you know, huge amounts of structural violence perpetrated against them, but they are also very agents. And I was also thinking about this in a different context from, I can't remember who was talking about, maybe it was you or somebody else raised the issue, kind of like women having kind of portfolio relations in order to survive in conditions of structural unemployment where they don't have jobs, but they might have caretaking responsibilities, even if they're just individuals, but if they are in a situation of providing care for family members or for children, how do they find ways of surviving? How do they bring in money? How do they put food on the table? And that might mean that they're engaged in certain forms of carrying drugs or having drugs in the house or other forms of activity that might be categorized as criminal, but really in many ways are about, if we think about resilience in a different notion, they're about surviving in circumstances and actually having to be providers. So I think that it's important to think about the ways in which the gendering of activity, I was kind of trying to suggest that in my paper about the novel, there are certain ideas about women as, having to perform a certain kind of labor of care work or nurture or of mothering, and these can be very constricting gendered categories, but they can also have a certain valence if women are having to commit certain kinds of activity in order to be providers. So I think it is important to think about the gendering of women's place in terms of work and forms of work that might not be legal, formal work in a formal economy. They might be forms of work that involve trafficking or other kinds of criminal activity because of the ways in which they're kind of structurally marginalized or cast out. So, I mean, I don't know if other people have comments on that, but that was something that's been running through my head.
I'll just build, I think, because... Sorry, Deborah Thomas. I think what you've asked raises the broader question that you're starting to get at. Like Dylan, I was quite surprised that the Haw article really didn't do anything in terms of broader context. Whereas the other article was all context and strategy and not very much grounded because it was taking a wider purview. But I think that also impoverishes our understandings of the ways that risk, resilience, vulnerability, all of the kind of catchwords that we're using are gendered historically and in these structural ways. So in fact, there is not one way to define what risk and vulnerability and resilience or empowerment really is, because of course there are different histories that saturate people's realities, and I think you see that, I mean, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but you see that, I saw it in the film, I went to the film last night, The Children of the Incursion, with Gatfest, and the ways, and we found this too, the ways that the girls were talking about their experiences, of course, were entirely different from the ways that the young men were. And I think it also feeds into these broader myths that we create. Like when we think about, who is the emblematic personification of disenfranchised youth, it's always a male, right? And so it means that when people are imagining interventions, the interventions that they're imagining for females are always about not having children. And that's the end of it. So it seems like we need to be more precise about our historical and sort of structural rendering of what these concepts look like for different segments of the populations that we work with.
I think that does feed, that notion of historical, the psychological, various understandings. And I think what I got from this was kind of relates to what you say, Dylan, about, academic research has to be pragmatic and practical. And I know about 10 years ago, I was, actually it's on tape, isn't it? I was working on in a department, and it was a phase where everyone had to be active researcher or practical researcher, and there was a notion of, well, there's 7 days in the week, and if you weren't spending the weekend sort of engaged, changing the world, you're not really up to the job. And I think there's that notion there of putting so much into the research that becomes sort of unsustainable in many ways. And I do think resilience is an interesting term, because it's been sort of gone, taken from academia, used in sort of practical terms and development terms, like rights to the city, became a buzzword of UN Habitat. And then it's sort of kind of fed back, saying, okay, you academics aren't doing enough in resilience, and it's sort of this almost a loop of meaning and practice that it gets churned around again, and then we'll invent another word for resilience, and then we go back to development work, and then it'll be, hang on, we're not being so-and-so enough. And I do think there's that element there that I guess these meetings have been trying to pick away at how to relate between academic research and pragmatic. Can I thank Sharae and Dylan especially, and all you for contributing?